Okay, next segment, as we are attempting to uh, cover some of the aspects of the inventory needed to play HCMechanized mechanized, it should be noted that some things have changed over the time, last couple of years, especially with our work in Hex Command Nova, where everything sci-fi kind of forced us or forced the situation into a very simplification system. One of the simplifications that we had to do to make the game move faster was to get away from the super detail of a World War II game that could be possible and simply say a lot of the markers on the table, status markers, if you will, are actually nice to have, but not necessary. There's really, unless you want to do it the certain way, unless you want to have that level of detail, almost as if it was like what was Squad Leader, where you have very specific things that are happening. It's a one-to-one game where one figure is one person, and that kind of a situation. Well, after some consideration, didn't actually take that long. We said, a lot of these table markers aren't needed. Maybe in a skirmish level game, where the whole table might represent a farm or something of that name. I think there was a game called Sergeants, with kind of touched on a status marker system. It's really not necessary for a company level game, which is what Hex Command Mechanized is. And so what we're looking at here are some examples of the table markers. These are representative markers. In other words, markers that represent something. And nobody knows what it represents other than the owner. So what would happen here is that these things would be given a mark, even a letter, a number, or something, and then they would be moved on the table instead of the object, actual miniature. And there are several of them ready to go. The Allies and the Germans have, or there are some that are already made, but there are more that can be made. And then the other marker that we have is we'll call them objective markers. They're just little flags that stand up on the game table, and they simply represent things of importance. Now, they don't mean that one thing is more important than the other. They simply are an identifier that this is a thing of importance. I don't want to say objective, because that would mean you take it and you kind of win, but that isn't always the case. It's one of the things that if you take it, own it, and such, will go into the overall, if you will, score. These are not points, they're just identifying marks. It could just be a circle or a square, it doesn't matter. And we've got a bunch of them where there could be several, there could be many in a single game, depending on the size of the game table. And that's what these are. We've got some blank ones as well. And we've actually, when I was looking at these, I realized that they are, in fact, too numerous. For instance, this was 17, 18, and 19. That's not necessary. That's way too many. So I just blanked out the number 1, and this becomes a single-digit item of importance. Okay, so that's what those things are, and that's how those work. And the other things I didn't show you because I just basically tossed them were the status indicators. For instance, things like radio, smoke, prone, etc., etc. And another question that some people might have is that how come there are no prone markers? There may be prone markers in other board games, other miniature games, and the fact of the matter is because you're always prone. Anybody who stands up is basically dead when you're being fired upon. You're almost always on the ground. So everybody here is always assumed, regardless where they are on the game table, to be seeking the best possible cover if they're fired upon as soon as they can get to it. They dive for cover, they take cover, they protect themselves, because that's just what soldiers have to do to survive. And once you get into a combat situation, you're almost always squatting down, kneeling, laying down, or something of that nature. So it's not necessary to show a prone marker. It's just, it goes without saying. When something is moving, obviously it's not prone, although it can be done. You don't move for speed by crawling. You move for speed by getting up. But still, it's the same kind of a deal where whenever you move, you've seen it in movies and such. Band of Brothers is a good example. You're dodging all the time. You're dodging all the time. You're being very quiet. You're being stealthy as much as you can be. And in those instances when we saw certain individuals being shot, it's because they became a obvious target. There was one example, I think it was Aaron Corps, where Lieutenant Winters had a courier come up to him, and the courier was immediately killed. Not because they thought he was a courier, but because they probably thought he was a commander. So a sniper, or who knows, but a bullet hit that person, and he was killed. And then obviously, red alert, because you're being targeted. Let's move out of here. So they scatter. And that's basically that kind of a situation. So when it comes to marking casualties, hits, and effects on the game table, we are going to use, like we have with the rest of the eras, the O-ring system. So a red hit is simply the worst possible hit that can happen. It is either a dead soldier or soldiers. And an incremental hit is an incidental type of casualty or effect. An incidental hit might be because the firing, well, typically it's because the firing is happening at very long range. And it's not injuring per se, but it is having an effect, a cumulative effect. So you can have a squad that will take 4 incremental hits before a full casualty hit is registered. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The system is in force, but it's the third hit. On the third incremental hit that's registered to a target, it becomes a regular normal damage. So it would be a red hit. Why do we do that in HCMechanized? Well, because there may be long-range fire that's not necessarily accurate, but it's causing a suppressive effect. And that's the same kind of a thing that would happen when, in more detail for the rules, if you were to order suppressive fire and put that marker on the table, it means everybody's unloading all their ammunition, or as much ammunition as possible, to keep the enemy, keep their head down. So a lot of bullets flying in the air, not necessarily hitting anything, but just causing the other guy some distress. And that's why it would be an incremental hit if it was caused to a target. For instance, you normally would say, I'm suppressing this hex. And then instead of a full, unless it of course was artillery, it's infantry fire. It's suppressive fire. You would put down, just like normal combat, you determine how many hits are caused and such, but they would be incremental hits. They wouldn't be a full red casualty hit. You're causing, over time, a lot of consternation in the target. All right, so that's where we are at for markers. As usual, there's a hold marker or a move marker that's placed. Now, you could also say, well, that just gives it away, doesn't it? Well, that's true. So there is a possibility of having these things registered in secret. But I think for the speed and brevity of the game, it doesn't really make that great of a difference. I mean, you could say, yeah, it's kind of important, but it depends if you want to do it or not. So put the marker on the table for something to move or something to not move. Hold or move. And that's simply that's it. That's it in a nutshell. Now, what about direct fire while moving? So these are issues that come up. They can be explained, and they are, and they're successfully explained. But what about indirect? In other words, you're moving, but you're firing high explosive in the direction of your enemy. You're not really firing to cause damage. You're just firing to cause a lot of again, consternation. So it wouldn't be an incremental damage. It would be the full normal damage. Say it was you're moving and it's high explosive fire and you're shooting at a farm area. You again, because you're not stopped, you're going to roll to see where that shot lands. and that's moving fire. Now, again, I have to say it. In the movie Fury, we saw the Tiger actually firing while not moving, and the Shermans were firing while moving. And it was very lucky for them that the field they were on was a golf course. It was extremely flat, and they were lucky for that. So they were able to think about, maybe potentially hitting the guy while they're moving. They figured, and probably rightly so, as soon as they stopped, they were dead. So the best thing to do is keep moving. At any rate, we won't go into too much of the issues with Fury, but it was an interesting way to see a reality that Band of Brothers didn't really present us with, which was tank-to-tank, vehicle-to-vehicle combat. So moving is one thing. Stationary is completely different. You're absolutely accurate when you are stationary. If you move and stop in the turn, the fact is you moved at all. So any penalties that are assessed are because of the fact you moved at all. Say you only move half and you stop, doesn't matter. You moved. If you are stationary, you fire and then you move, again, different story. So those are the kinds of things that come up, and they are adjudicated accordingly. So let's move on, and then we'll come back to other organizational and inventory stuff that we're doing. We're actually getting close to wrapping it all up. There's a couple of ideas that are floating out there now, mainly because what kind of armor are we going to put in, if any? And perhaps, like we did once before, an entire armored car game, which is basically like Car Wars. So we might just have a bunch of armored cars here. We've got two, and the Germans haven't got any yet, but they might. And we got two armored cars per se, right? We got two 50 caliber equipped half-tracks. Now, these are soft-skinned. Well, no, they're armored, but it's tin, right? You got to look at it as being tin armor by comparison. It will stop normal small arms, but certainly heavy small arm, 50 caliber, for instance. Actually, it's interesting. The 50 caliber was called anti-tank for a while. Any heavy machine gun firing at a armored car is potentially going to hurt it, especially a BESA 14.7 millimeter. I guess it was mostly anti-aircraft gun, but at any rate, that is a different story. So those are heavy machine guns. The German 20 millimeter, which was a rapid firing clip fed anti-tank gun. Even though it was 20 millimeter clip fed, in the aircraft it was belt fed. But the fact is it was a 20 millimeter, and it was, as you've seen even in Band of Brothers, that 20 millimeter is deadly, especially against infantry. It's bad. A quad 20, or even in some cases the 37 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, yeah, still bad because they're rapid firing. So we give them a pretty good effect. So those are the kinds of things that we'll cover. We have covered, as a matter of fact. So we won't bother maybe going through that in this phase of the inventory and the assessment for the scenarios. Bear in mind that we probably will move on to the other game tables and the four that you're looking at. We haven't talked about the horse and musket game that's toward the camera. We've got the American Civil War out there. It might just revert to either Napoleonics or American Rev, because I'll tell you what, it looks nice. It's good to see the terrain on the game table again. So the types of vehicles that are going to be coming in here are not going to be Tigers. There's not going to be Panthers, but there might. Right? We might just have one, but it's going to be, game over, right? And when you enter a heavy vehicle into a situation, especially a close combat situation, if you don't get it, knock it out, you're in trouble, because especially on the German side, the gun is just, it will kill almost everything that it fires at. It will cause so much damage for us. Remember, we don't kill on a one-shot deal. You get so much damage indicated or put onto a target that it essentially does kill it. But there are times when enough damage is caused that doesn't actually kill something, it just makes it stop. Like, for instance, you'll have 3 movement hits in a single firing. And that, wow, that just simply means the tread is gone. The ability for the thing to move is gone. Engine, whatever. But that can happen. It's not dead, but it can't move. So that's the kind of thing that can happen. On the other hand, you could have 3 combat hits, and whatever value that the thing had for combat is gone. But it can still move. And so therefore, especially if you're playing with secret damage, the other guy won't know that your gun is knocked out. So that's a thing to bear in mind. Okay, so we'll come back and talk about some other, maybe some armored car stuff we'll throw in here.